What's up, nerds? The Russian Legion is launching a cross-border attack on Russia, and I want to talk about it because it's kind of interesting. Not only is the attack itself something that we need to digest, we need to talk more about what the Russian Legion is and what some of their allied groups are. Now, this news is still breaking as of the time of this recording. I'm recording this on March 12th, 2024. And this attack appears to be attacking the border cities along the Ukrainian border with the Belgorod Oblast and the Kursk Oblast in Russia. Now, that's very close to Kharkiv, that kind of borders of Kharkiv Oblast in Ukraine, just to kind of give you an idea on where exactly this attack is happening. And it appears to have caught Russian forces by complete surprise. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what this attack is. We're going to talk a little bit about who the Russian Legion is, who the Russian Volunteer Corps are, who also appears to be involved in this attack, and then why attacks like these actually matter, because these kinds of attacks can actually serve a strategic purpose in this war that we need to talk about. Now, back to the attacks, of course, they're still going on as of the time of this recording, so there may be some more information about what's going on in these attacks by the time you watch this video. But as of the time that I'm recording this, what we're seeing is that it really initiated with a massive drone attack all across Russia from Ukraine. In fact, this drone attack was one of the biggest drone attacks that Ukraine has launched since the beginning of the war. It attacked key industrial facilities, including one of the largest oil refinery plants in Russia in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. And that plant itself was over 800 kilometers away from Ukraine. So pretty deep attacks going on here, pretty widespread attacks, and attacks on very key facilities. Now, this facility in Nizhny Novgorod is incredibly notable because it actually was responsible for the refining of up to 5.8% of Russia's total refined oil. Now, that is a significant number. From what I've seen, it appears that at least half the plant is offline because of this attack. And so we're going to have to just kind of wait and see over time how big of an impact that has on Russia's ability to refine its oil and get that oil to its soldiers. Of course, I see that this attack happens, and I'm thinking now this is either hubris or complacency that allows an attack like this to happen. An attack 800 kilometers inside of Russia, and nothing intercepts any of the drones that were targeting the facility. That is so much space that Russia has to have some form of air defense, some form of ability to shoot down a drone like that, and they failed to do it. That theme of hubris or complacency is actually going to play out pretty consistently as we discuss this attack across Belgorod and Kursk Oblast. Now, of course, we're talking about some other industrial targets that were hit inside Russia, some other oil refinery plants, some other manufacturing plants, very important things. But that all provided cover for what followed. And what followed was an attack by the Russian Legion, as well as the Russian Volunteer Corps and some other Russian groups inside Belgorod and Kursk Oblasts. The Russian Legion posted a video of their opening speech, basically discussing how they were planning to liberate Russia from Putin and the Siloviki, how this was the time for Russians to rise up, to join the cause, and to basically create a revolution. This then preceded fighting in several border towns, including what was reported to be the takeover of one border town in the Kursk Oblast by the Russian Legion. And we've seen continued fighting over several towns thus far, including some air defense engagements as well as artillery duels all across the border. It appears, just from what I've seen, looking at maps on where the Russian Legion is attacking, they could be attempting to ultimately want to target the city of Belgorod, which is a pretty strategic city. However, they also have another push in the Kursk Oblast, which could be a salient attempting to draw some forces away. And of course, like we said with that opening speech and some of the messages that have followed that opening speech, there's been ongoing public messaging from the Russian Volunteer Corps and from the Russian Legion that this is all a spring revolution, that it's all kind of starting to start now, and that if there's any time for Russians to rise up against Putin, it's now. We're going to talk a little bit about what that might mean and, how that's significant here in just a moment. So, who exactly is the Russian Legion? Who's the Russian Volunteer Corps? And how do these attacks play into the overall picture of the war, but also the big picture for Russia itself? Now, the Russian Legion is a collection of Russian defectors and volunteers that initially formed in March 2022, immediately following the start of the war. And really that happened whenever a whole company of Russian soldiers defected from the Russian army, joined the Ukrainians, and formed this group. And since then, the Russian Legion has, at least reportedly, grown to a strength of around 2 battalions. So at least 600 or so soldiers. However, that's not necessarily a perfect estimate. Ukraine has also helped facilitate the growth of this group by offering Russian POWs a chance to join this group. However, those POWs then go through extensive evaluation and training to make sure that they're actually with the cause and they're not just joining to save their own life or sabotage the group. Now, the Russian Legion is notably, it's pro-Ukrainian in this war, but it's also pro-Russian in that it wants to see Russia made great. It is decidedly anti-Putin. That's the key part here. Their slogans, for instance, to kind of give you an idea on what they believe, are Za Rossию and Za Svobodu, which means for Russia and for freedom, as well as Rossiya будет svobodnoi, which means Russia will be free. And if I goof those pronunciations, forgive me, my Russian's not great. So, but that kind of gives you the idea that it's, they believe in the freedom of the Russian people and they want freedom from Putin. However, there's some kind of key aspects about their ideology that we're going to talk about here in a second, so don't get too excited. But they've reportedly, the Russian Legion has reportedly fought in places like Bakhmut, where they've gained some important battlefield experience. They've also launched previous cross-border raids into Belgorod before. So yes, we have seen cross-border raids just like what we're seeing right now before. And that's going to factor into my analysis here in just a moment as well once we start talking about this attack and how it plays into the big picture. Now, their leadership appears to be using pseudonyms, and I believe that this might be to protect their families, which might still be in Russia. That being said, the FSB probably knows who these people are, but the Legion spokesperson is a guy that goes by the name of Caesar. That kind of takes us to the ideology, right? Now, at least officially, the Russian Legion identifies as moderate centrist, and they believe in the liberation of Russia from Putin and the Siloviki. Now, some of the membership, like Caesar, for instance, they come from a far right-wing and ultra-nationalist background, as well as several different neo-Nazi groups from within Russia. That's important to remember here, especially whenever we talk about the Russian Volunteer Corps here in just a moment. The Russian Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps believe both that the only way to take down Putin is through armed resistance. That's really why they formed out of this war and why they have been so, active since the war began, especially in launching these attacks inside of Russia. The Russian Legion is allied with the Russian Volunteer Corps. It's another anti-Putin group, similar to the Russian Legion, albeit much smaller than the Russian Legion. It does also have a differing ideology. The Russian Volunteer Corps is more extreme, right-wing. They actually pull inspiration, and their group logo actually pulls inspiration from a Nazi group in the 1930s in the German-occupied Russia. And so, while these groups are kind of trying to fight for, the downfall of Putin, let's not forget that there are there's some Nazi stuff going on here, so let's not get crazy. Now let's talk about why this attack in Belgorod actually matters, because it actually can be a pretty significant event. But we're just going to have to wait and see how, what the follow-up to this attack is and really what the extent of this attack is. Now, I would not be shocked if this is really just another raid. And a raid kind of distinguishes itself by being, it's an attack on an objective, but it's not designed to hold or defend that objective once you take it. You attack it, maybe there's some sort of value, some intelligence value of that objective, and then you immediately withdraw. You're not defending it, you're just going there to get something and then you're leaving pretty much. This attack could be designed to launch something a bit larger. I mean, we've seen crazier things happen in this war for sure, especially inside of Russia. But I would be a little shocked if that was the case right now. These raids could actually be incredibly significant because they might force Russia to move forces from the occupied territories of Ukraine and to defend this border with Ukraine in the north. And that actually could lead to strategic impacts in Ukraine. That's actually what the real threat to Russia is here. The fact that these raids can happen in the first place is a huge issue for Russia. The fact that Russian groups, these kinds of militia groups that aren't that sizable can launch these cross-border raids, reportedly seize at least one town in Russia and potentially threaten other towns inside of Russia. That is a huge issue for the Russian government, not only for their image, but also for the Russian military, because it's a failure on some part. And that's a similar issue with the drone strikes that we talked about earlier that initiated this entire attack. It's, we're talking about hubris or complacency that allows for these things to happen, and that generally leads to people getting fired, and then, drastic changes happening, structurally to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. forcing Russia to shift forces from the front lines in Ukraine over to the north to protect their border with Ukraine, that can have a strategic impact, because that not only forces Russia to account for nearly double the length of the front line that they're having to now account for on the border, that increases drastically the amount of equipment that they need to use, the amount of soldiers that they need to pull from, everything, the amount of ammunition that they might require if they're expecting more attacks, just to make sure everybody's properly equipped. And again, that pulls everything from Ukraine. So for Russia to maintain a consistent staffing in the front line of Ukraine and even maintain offensive pressure in Ukraine while also maintaining proper staffing on the border of Ukraine, they're going to have to either get more mobilized personnel into the military, produce more equipment, more notably, and really they're going to have to do this very quickly, because this attack is happening right now and it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Now, notably, this is going to require a lot more air defense, because it's one thing to station troops on the border to make sure that, enemy soldiers can't get through. It's another thing to make sure that drones aren't passing over their head. So they're going to have to get more air defense spread out and protecting key sites, kind of like the oil refinery that we talked about in Nizhny Novgorod. Very key strategic facilities that Ukraine has managed to target that can make a huge impact in Russia's ability to sustain this war. No, Russia is not about to collapse because of these attacks, but these kinds of things can compile and easily start to produce significant strain on the Russian military and really on the Russian government's ability to prosecute this war. Now, with spreading out air defense and defending key strategic sites, that leads to a similar issue in Ukraine, where Russia has less air defense in Ukraine. That might create some gaps, and that creates opportunities for Ukraine. In general, I think that what we're seeing with these attacks is that they're designed to cause some kind of stress and chaos in the Russian rear area, namely around Belgorod, which is a key strategic city. I mean, especially early in the war, it served as a very strategic point in allowing Russia to logistically sustain its attack in the north. Since then, we haven't seen so much happen there, especially since Russia kind of abandoned the north. But should Russia want to launch another attack, Belgorod's going to play a significant role. Now, 2 battalions are not going to take the city of Belgorod, and they're probably not going to get that deep in Russia. But that being said, we saw Wagner make it all the way to the gates of Moscow, and then they voluntarily turned around. So again, crazier things have happened in this war. What I think we're seeing is just a raid to try to shift Russian forces away from the front line into the border, but we're just going to have to wait and see here. Of course, these attacks also can facilitate the insertion of more sabotage groups, which can go deeper into Russia. So even if Russia does move air defense to those key strategic facilities, a sabotage group could also be just as effective. So these attacks serve a lot of different purposes, and they can, really help Ukraine in this conflict overall, because it's producing less stress on their forces in the south and in the east, and allows for some opportunities to get some more special groups into Russia, namely Russian groups, like the Russian Legion or the Russian Volunteer Corps, or even Ukrainian special forces into Russia to cause some more chaos deeper inside of Russia. Of course, we talked a little bit in the beginning about the public messaging around these attacks from the Russian leadership and the Russian Volunteer Corps, and how they're really kind of trying to make this into what they call the Spring Revolution. Again, I'll be shocked if that actually is anything meaningful and not, just another raid, and that this is not just another kind of like messaging opportunity to get more Russians to defect, or to kind of see that, okay, maybe it is a possibility that we could fight Putin, or that we could stand up and resist Putin, because there are groups that are fighting it. Now, with all of that being said, we're going to continue to watch this. We'll talk about this later as more things continue to develop, but I at least wanted to discuss who the Russian Legion is and who the Russian Volunteer Corps are. I want to hear your thoughts about these attacks and about these groups. What do you think we're seeing right now? And certainly, you're going to be watching this with more information about these attacks than what I have right now. So let me know what you're seeing and what your thoughts are. And, we'll continue to discuss down in the video comments. Of course, subscribe for more of these kinds of videos talking about the war in Ukraine. I'll probably talk about this war more than some of the other topics internationally, because because there's a lot going on with it. But we also talk about the war in Israel. We talk about other Middle Eastern issues, as well as, other security issues going on in the world. So be sure to subscribe if that interests you, and like this video if you found it helpful. With all that, I'll see you later. Bye.